Welcome everyone who's tuning in to Essentials of Automations, Optimizing FME Workflows with Parameters. So this is the first part in our Essentials of Automations series that we're kicking off here. And today I'm joined by an amazing team of presenters. I'll hand it over to Evie to introduce herself first.
Yeah, hi, I'm Evie, and I am a technical support specialist on the FME Forum team. And I'm here. I'm glad to be here. Pass it on to Natalie.
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Natalie. Like Evie, I'm a technical support specialist with SAFE's FME Forum support team, and also happy to be here.
Yeah, and I'm Matt, same role as Evie and Natalie, just on the FME Flow side. So I work mostly with that product, helping customers with any issues they have and helping them get the most out of the product in their FME Flow journey.
Awesome. Thank you all. If you do have any questions during the webinar, please drop those into the questions tab on the bottom right, and we'll have some time remaining at the end for Q&A. And keep letting us know where you're tuning in from, or leave any comments during the webinar in the chat panel there in the bottom right. Share your emoji reactions with us during the webinar with the bottom middle button. And if you do have any audio issues during the webinar, you can click that help button for 4 simple steps to take. So with that, I will get our presenters to turn off their webcams just to save on some bandwidth for the remainder here. With that, I will pass things over to Natalie to take us through our agenda.
Yeah, thanks, Elizabeth, and welcome to the webinar, everybody. Today, Matt, Evie, and I are going to provide you with a parameters tour across the FME platform, beginning with a high-level overview of parameters and FME in general, and then moving into a discussion of a few key parameter categories as they apply to FME Forum and as well FME Flow. We'll share with you some of our own parameter best practices, and then summarize the key points that we hope you'll take away from today's discussion. And finally, we'll open things up for a Q&A period at the end. So I'm going to start things off by taking just a few moments to go through some high-level points about parameters and FME and introduce you to the various categories of parameters found throughout the FME platform. But first, I'd just like to highlight the 2 applications you'll see today, which combined make up the FME platform offered by Safe Software. FME Forum is the authoring environment where you build your data integration workflows. And automation of these workflows is provided by FME Flow, which can be deployed on-prem or in your own private cloud. We also offer FME Flow deployed in a fully hosted AWS cloud environment called FME Flow Hosted. So at some point, I'm certain this question may have popped up for at least a few of us here today. Why are we hosting an entire session dedicated to parameters? Well, parameters are valuable in FME. In fact, I'm going to try and convince you, if you're not already convinced, that parameters just might be those unsung heroes of the FME platform. Now, this is a strong statement, I know, but it's got some strong support. FME's various readers, writers, connectors, transformers, apps, and other workspace or job components are capable of performing a fantastic variety of tasks for you, and of course that's an understatement. But without the instructions that parameters provide, none of these components can do their jobs. So the 3 bullet points you see on this slide are what we hope to highlight for you today. Employing parameters thoughtfully in a given FME workflow will improve those instructions, which in turn leads to better end results or better outputs. This point alone emphasizes the significant value that parameters provide to a given workflow. Better application of parameters will also improve the experience of users running those translations or jobs, by providing users with opportunities to give their own instructions specific to their needs right at runtime. And workspace and job maintainability can be significantly improved over the long term with a well thought out approach to parameter application. Another big reason we felt motivated to spend some time on this topic is just the fact that parameters really are everywhere in FME. You will never have an FME workspace or job that will run successfully without the specification of at least one parameter value, and for good reason. And as I alluded to before, FME needs specific, contextually appropriate instructions on what to do and how to do it. And you can see just everywhere in a very simple workspace where you'll see the word parameters. It really, truly is everywhere. Think about a given FME canvas object, say a tester transformer you see here, as if it were its own paragraph of a greater instruction manual, but this paragraph contains some task-specific fill-in-the-blanks. Well, parameters are those fill-in-the-blanks. Once the instruction manual user fills in each blank with a task-specific word or phrase, the full paragraph's instructions are much easier to understand for the user, so that they can follow those instructions and accomplish their end goal successfully. In an FME context, the workspace user or author would fill in those blanks with meaningful, contextually appropriate parameter values to complete each Canvas object's set of instructions, which, in turn, will provide a complete instruction manual, i.e. the workspace, that FME can readily execute for you. Now, I'm sure some of us, at some point, have been presented with the warning seen in this image. This warning will be thrown anytime at least one Canvas object is missing a parameter value at runtime. The warning even mentions by name the affected Canvas object and where to go to quickly remedy the situation. This is FME's friendly way of telling you that it's missing some key instructions, highlighting just how important these parameter values are to the correct functionality of any given workspace. So let's establish the base definition of a parameter in an FME context as any part of a dialog, a prompt, a window, where information can be entered or selected somehow, whether that info is provided by the workspace author, the workspace user, or some other means, i.e. reference to another parameter's value, say. Well, that's a pretty broad definition when you start to imagine all of the dialogues, windows, and prompts you encounter while building or testing or perhaps running a workspace. So, to make this definition just a little more manageable and easier to wrap your mind around, we have divided parameters in FME into a set of slightly less broad categories, which you see listed here. Now, I'm going to give a quick overview of these highlighted parameter categories, so the ones you see here in bright white, and then I'll hand the stage over to Evie and Matt, who will expand on the three remaining categories that you see slightly grayed out here. So let's begin with reader and writer parameters. Reader and writer parameters provide instructions on how FME should read in or write out your data. So you'll see these parameters in the add reader or add writer dialogues anytime you add a reader or a writer to your canvas. And from those add reader or writer dialogues, you can then access the more format-specific reader or writer parameters simply by selecting the parameters button therein. These parameters are also fully accessible from the navigator window after the reader or writer has been added to a workspace. Now we see the feature type parameters on screen here. Feature type parameters provide instructions on how FME should handle one individual reader or writer feature type. So you can access feature type parameters by simply double-clicking on an orange feature type sitting on your canvas, or by expanding the feature types node of a reader or a writer in the navigator window. Just keep in mind that feature type parameters are in addition to the reader and writer parameters. So the reader and writer parameters apply to all of their associated feature types, while feature type parameters are specified on a per feature type basis. So think about feature type parameters as kind of additional options for fine-tuning the reading or writing of your data. Transformer parameters help complete those specific instructions for how FME should execute each individual task of a workflow beyond the reading or writing of your data. So we're filling in those little paragraphs that I mentioned before. These parameters are accessible after a transformer has been added to your canvas by either expanding the transformers node of the navigator window or by double-clicking on the transformer while it's sitting on your main canvas. Again, if there are transformers that are missing values and you try to run the workspace, you'll receive that lovely warning that I showed you earlier. So providing meaningful values for all transformers in your workspace is thus crucial to obtaining those valuable outputs you're looking for. Custom transformer parameters. So these are the parameters that help control the actions that are very specific to the behavior of a custom transformer. So you'll see these parameters under the Transformer Parameters node highlighted here on screen for you of the Navigator window anytime you're viewing the definition of a custom transformer. So you won't see this Transformer Parameters node in the main canvas on your main workspace. You have to view the definition of your custom transformer to see the Transformer Parameters node. So you can view the definition of a custom transformer by choosing to edit an embedded custom transformer or by opening the FMX definition file of a custom transformer in its own workspace. So right now we're viewing the definition of an embedded custom transformer. But it is important to note that you might see slightly different custom transformer parameters available in the exported custom transformers FMX file versus what you would see when looking at an embedded custom transformers definition. So just keep that in mind if you're working with custom transformers. Workspace parameters. I find these are often overlooked, so I just wanted to highlight them a bit here. Workspace parameters help provide instructions on translation preferences, such as your preferred Python interpreter, your preferred Esri ArcGIS product license that you'd like to work with. And they also provide a place to include some key metadata points for the workspace. These parameters are all available under the Workspace Parameters node of the Navigator window, and I find they're actually very useful anytime a workspace is meant to be shared amongst multiple users, just to give help documentation or history of edits to the workspace so that other users can tap into that. And finally, FME parameters. FME parameters provide values which reference specific FME system settings. So values like the file path to the current workspace, the current workspace's file name, the build number of the FME version that's currently in use. These are the types of values that you can tap into by making use of FME parameters in your workspaces. And often it's easier to reference the value of an FME parameter rather than manually typing the full file path out yourself. So these come in handy. You can access and apply FME parameters from the text editors found throughout FME Workbench. So these parameters can be applied in the same way you would apply a user parameter. In fact, FME parameters essentially are private user parameters. They're just configured to work specifically with FME system settings. So the image you see on screen here is just showing the text editor that you can access from the value column of the attribute creator. So this is just one place where you can access it. So now I'm going to pass things over to Evie, who will get into some more detailed information on another category of parameters called user parameters.
Thanks, Natalie. Yeah, so I will be going over specifically user parameters and again, specifically the choice type as well as the feature for conditional visibility. So what is our goal, block, key, and result here that we are looking for? We want to be able to have our users to have a choice, the ability to prompt the user for input in our workspaces. So the key here is user parameters. The user is able to have an impact on the outcome by being prompted for their input. So what does that look like? We have here a lot of different types of user parameters. We will be going over the choice here. The choice user parameter has two varieties, either drop down or list. And that can be configured lots of different ways. So to go through that here, we have the value in display pairs. So the value is what is being performed on inside the workspace, and the display is what appears to the user. So what they will actually choose in either the drop-down or the list. Something to help with that is importing from a data set. You can use that to make it easier for you to load in all of those choices, all of those value display pairs, so that you're not making errors when you're typing them in. And to go through conditional visibility, this is when it enables authors to control when published parameters are exposed at runtime based on specific conditions. It allows irrelevant parameters to be disabled or hidden depending on the value of another user parameter. This feature helps reduce translation errors by preventing the input of incorrect parameter values at runtime. So to get into this, I'll show you a little bit of all of this in a demo where I will go over each of these. So when at runtime here, why would someone use conditional parameters? This use case is for a scenario to provide extra input for the user where they would like to derive statistics from the area, or simply receive the output. So this gives that option. If it's not needed, they can uncheck that checkbox. In the user parameter manager, we have here, you can right click for the manage user parameters window. For advanced users, here's where all of the different types of user parameters can be found and created, and how you might configure a choice parameter. You can also use this panel to modify and configure all of your other user parameters. So here is how you would import your choices from another data set. So yeah, and then we can go into as well the preferred method of creating a user parameter is directly inside the transformer itself. This way, the user parameter will be created in the correct type for you to use. So it tells you that this is a yes/no parameter. The default is no, and you can edit these as well. So yeah, so that just gives you a brief overview of how you may want to do this and how you do this in FME form and author this. So for the key points of this demonstration is that user parameters allow for user input in your workspace, and conditional visibility allows you to have parameters depend on one another. And so we have some new articles that I'll share in the chat in a moment that will help you go through this and build it out for yourself and try it out. Yeah. Pass this on to Matt. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Evie. Thank you. So I'm going to talk a bit about parameters in FME Flow now. So FME Flow is the second part of the platform that Natalie talked about earlier. It's a web application where you can publish up the workflows you create and author in FME Workbench and do a whole lot more with them. You can let users run them without them needing to download the desktop product, or you can schedule them, create apps out of them, and a whole lot more. So FME Flow parameters, these are very helpful when authoring your workspace in FME Workbench, knowing that you're going to publish it up to FME Flow for others to consume. So for example, you might have reference files and folders that will be hosted in FME Flow. You want to point to those resources locally while you're developing your workflow. You can also reference parts of the FME Flow system when the translation is run on FME Flow. For example, you might want to know who the user who's running the workspace is. You might want to know what the job ID is, and other runtime specific information. So the FME Flow parameters menu you see in the Workbench Navigator lets you set temporary values for development and testing. And when you publish up to Flow, those values are essentially ignored. In fact, I don't think they even come up to Flow. It's just for development and testing. So an example of that, the FME shared resource data FME Flow parameter. You'll see here, I've set that to a temp location, C drive temp, and I'm going to use that as my working FME Flow resource folder. And then I've got some subfolders in there that I also have in FME Flow down below. You'll see this is the FME Flow resource folder structure. So I've just kind of recreated that locally for development testing. So user parameters on FME Flow. The user parameters you define in your FME workspace and FME Workbench are rendered in FME Flow as web form fields. And certain parameters will render differently, like the geometry parameter we'll see, and that you can see in the screenshot here. That'll let users draw polygons on a map or drop points in and other types of geometry. Whereas in FME Workbench, a geometry parameter is expecting some form of geometry, a GeoJSON, and I think there's an XML format as well, which is a little less user-friendly. It's fine for someone developing a workspace, but on FME Flow, you might want to make that a little more consumable. The person might not even know what FME is who's running the workspace. File parameters let users drag and drop files. We'll see that as well. That's another way they render a bit differently in Flow. So this lets you create rich user experiences on FME Flow simply by configuring your user parameters in FME Workbench. There's no coding required. Another type of parameter that's pretty new to the FME Flow platform is deployment parameters. This is a special type of parameter that lives in a deployment parameter store on FME Flow. And then you can access these parameters in FME Workbench when you synchronize to an FME Flow server. The value for the parameter can be different across FME Flow instances you may have. So if you have like an FME Flow staging instance and an FME Flow prod, you could have a different, in the screenshot here, we have employee database, you could have a different database value so that when you reference that in your workspace and publish to those different environments, the workspace is smart enough to know which value it should be using. So we can kind of see that on the next slide here. Let's pretend the screenshot at the top is a test FME Flow instance. So the name of the deployment parameter is employee database, and that's pointing to a Postgres test database. And then down below, we'll say that's our production FME Flow instance, and it's pointing, the same parameter name is pointing to a different value, which is our prod employee database. And where do you find these when you want to use them in your workspace? So they're a little bit buried under user parameters and then deployment parameters, and we see our employee database parameter there. So I can select that as my database connection in a transformer reader writer. So let's look at a demo now for extracting data for an area and see some of these parameters in use. So we'll look at a scenario here. In this scenario, we want to author a workspace that lets a user download cell signal data points for an area of interest that they draw on a map. So our goal is to allow a non-FME user to interact with a workspace to extract data. The blocker is the user has no knowledge of GeoJSON, which is a format they'd have to enter in Workbench. They also don't have FME Workbench, of course. They just simply want to draw an area of interest on a map and get the data back for that area. So the key here is going to be a geometry user parameter with an FME Flow app. And our result is going to be an easy to use no-code app. So let's look at this demo now. So here's our workspace in FME Workbench. We've got a parameter fetcher that's getting our geometry parameter we'll look at shortly. And then we've got some cell signal data sitting in an Esri geodatabase. And we want to take that area of interest and clip it with the area provided by the user. And we're going to take that clip data and write it out to a file format chosen by the user. So let's look at our user parameters. We've got the area to download, and you'll see that this is a geometry parameter. So yeah, the context of the parameter will be different on the right, depending on what you select. Here's a file parameter for our destination format so that we see different values on the right. Just like Evie showed, if I click the plus, you can see all the different types of parameters. So I'm going to expand this geometry configuration. You'll see that we're only allowing polygons right now. I could change that, let the user draw different types of geometry, but we just want them to draw a polygon around their area of interest. We've got our destination format, and that's using a generic writer. So we're going to let a user pick that. And for the formats that they can pick, we've imported them. Same thing with the coordinate systems to make sure that we have valid values. And we're going to use some conditional visibility here as well, and only show the coordinate system if the file format they pick is not Excel out of the limited list we provided, because there's no coordinate system in Excel. So click OK, and let's run this in Workbench. And you'll see when I click run, we'll get the parameters, and it wants my geometry as GeoJSON in this case, which is fine if I'm developing it, but my end user is not going to know that. So we'll publish up to Flow. We'll create an app out of this that's more easily consumable. And here we are in FME Flow. This is the Run Workspace page that an FME Flow user would have access to. Here's our workspace, and we'll see already that the parameters that we saw in our User Parameter Manager look a little differently here. So our area to download has this map icon to let a user draw on a map. But I'd like to show this in a Flow app. So you can use your workspace to create FME Flow apps, and we have other webinars about that. So this is one that's in the background. It's our workspace, and if I click that map icon, this is the control I get. So I can only draw polygons because that's all I've allowed in FME Workbench in my settings. So I can draw that polygon around an area in West End Vancouver. My output format, because it's shapefile, it's letting me pick a coordinate system. But if I go pick Excel, we'll see that conditional visibility we had configured, and it's going to hide the coordinate system. So this is just a pretty simple example, but you can really build pretty rich user interfaces just using the user parameter manager in FME Workbench. So if I click run now, I'll get a data download link because my app's registered with that web service to download the data for the area that I drew. So that's just a quick example of the geometry parameter for anyone who hasn't used it, and some of the power it can unlock on FME Flow when you publish your workspace there. Some of the key points are that user parameters do render differently in FME Flow. The geometry parameter allows users to draw geometry on a map in FME Flow, and user parameters let you build rich user experiences on the web with no code, provided you have FME Flow. So let's look at another quick example using file submission. So in this scenario, we want to author a workspace that lets shelter workers, people volunteering at different shelters, submit a CSV file of the food programs available at their location. And we have a data warehouse in Snowflake where we keep the master list of all the different shelters and the different food programs they offer. So our goal, again, is to allow non-FME users to upload their CSV file and have it go to the correct destination database. And our blockers are, well, how do we easily let them submit that file? We want to validate the schema of that file and make sure it's okay. And so we need to have a validation schema file, and where are we going to store that? How are we going to reference that when we're authoring our workspace, but also on FME Flow, and the database environment. So we have different database environments in our system for staging and production. So we want to point to the right one dynamically. So the key is going to be using file user parameter, an FME Flow parameter, and a deployment parameter. And we'll take a look at this demo now. Okay, so here's our workspace. We are pulling in our shelters from a table in Snowflake, and then we're going to take a CSV file from the user of the food programs at their shelter. We'll do our schema validation, which compares it against an existing file. We'll join to our shelters, and then we're going to read in the existing master table of shelter food programs and use this really useful transformer called the change detector. It'll detect changes between the two data sets and we'll use those changes to update the master listen snowflake accordingly. So if we look at our user parameters here, our schema validation file is one that the user is not going to submit. This is one that's just going to live on FME Flow as a static file. And so we're referencing that FME shared resource data flow parameter. So that's here under FME Flow parameters, shared resource data. And that's where our schema validation CSV file is going to live. And so by referencing that in Workbench as I develop, I don't have to change it when I the path when I publish up to FME Flow. So I can see here that I've set that shared resource data path to temporarily my C drive to mimic the resource master folder on, or root folder, I should say, on FME Flow. Then we have our source food program CSV file. That's the one the user is going to submit. And finally, our database connection. So this is connecting to Snowflake here. And we have a hard-coded connection value right now. We don't want to do that because we have multiple Snowflake databases for different environments in our ecosystem. So I just synchronized to a Flow instance to see the deployment parameters available there. And we see that we have a few here. We've got an ArcGIS Online connection, URLs, and I've got a Snowflake connection here. So we'll say that we've synchronized to our staging FME Flow instance, for example, and it has these deployment parameters in the store, and it's the value for its Snowflake parameter is this user at that Snowflake cloud instance. And that's the one we want to use for when this is run on staging. But when it's run on a different FME Flow environment, that Snowflake connection might be totally different and point to a production database. So to do this, we're going to go into our parameter default value, and we're going to pick that deployment parameter. And the reason I'm seeing that is because I've synchronized to Flow again. These live in FME Flow, these parameters. And now by choosing Snowflake as the connection, we'll see that in our reader and our writer, we've got Snowflake. You'll see that there's a Snowflake deployment parameter there selected. So let's publish up to FME Flow. And let's look at our resources. So here's the path that I had temporarily recreated locally for my schema validation file. That's one that's just going to kind of be more static. As an administrator, I might go update that if the schema changes. And here is an app I'm going to create out of that workspace. So let's look at the parameters of this app. We'll see we have our file parameters. So they render a little bit differently than what we see in Workbench. And you'll see that I'm actually hiding that first schema validation file parameter. So I've got show an app unchecked. We definitely want to show the source food program CSV file the user is going to submit. So we check that off. And then our database connection, the same thing, we've unchecked that. And the reason it's picking up this Snowflake connection instance is because that's what we've set our deployment parameter to in the deployment parameter store. So on a different instance, that value would be different. And we want to hide that as well. So we want to give the admin on Flow the opportunity to change it, but we don't want the user to pick the database connection, of course. So this is all the user is going to see. Just give me the CSV file and we'll do the rest. So let's pick a CSV file and we can drag and drop it in. That's going to upload it as a temporary file to FME Flow. Click OK, and we can run our workflow using that temporary upload. And because this is just running on the job submitter web service or translation service, we just get a completed message back letting us know that the file was uploaded successfully, passed schema validation, and it's been written to Snowflake. So let's look at some of the key points here and the key takeaways from that demo. So the file folder user parameter allows users to submit files to a workflow through drag and drop. So it renders differently in FME Flow versus FME Workbench. FME Flow parameters let you author your workspace for FME Flow. And you can make workspaces easier to deploy to different environments with deployment parameters. So let's talk about some parameter best practices now. And I'm going to pass it off to, I'm not sure if Natalie or Evie's doing this one.
I'll take this one, Matt.
Great, thanks.
So yeah, we're going to talk about a few of our own parameter best practices that we hope you can make use of in your own workspaces. The first one we have here is all about parameter type. Those parameter types that Evie highlighted in her demo. I've just got the slide up here, the topmost slide here for reference. It is really important to consider parameter type when planning out your use of parameters in your own workflows. Every parameter in FME has an underlying type. Again, the slide here shows that. For a given workflow to function correctly, there has to be a parameter type match between each parameter that you create or apply and the target parameters that you wish to apply those parameters to. Otherwise, you're going to run into some errors. So this need for parameter type matchup is why it's best to create your user parameters from the parameters dialog of those target canvas objects, which is what the bottom image there is showing you. Parameters created in this way are by default the correct parameter type for the target canvas object parameter. So you can consider the parameter manager as exactly that. It's a tool for managing and editing those user parameters that you've already created. Creating user parameters straight from the parameter manager should really be considered more of an advanced user task. So I'll hand it off to Evie now.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I just want to hammer in the whole condition of visibility feature that we have and make use of it. We've seen it in a couple different forms here through the various demonstrations, but it keeps the runtime parameter prompt looking clean and it reduces errors by unnecessary input from the user. And I also want to highlight the import from dataset feature, where it keeps the values consistent with your dataset and it reduces confusion from the users. I also want to acknowledge that this is not a dynamic feature. You will have to import it every single time you want to create a new choice for your users. Yeah, so, and I'll hand it off to Matt.
Thanks, Evie. Yeah, so this is a Riker scale I developed. If you're familiar with Star Trek The Next Generation, this is Commander Riker. We use the Riker scale here, although I might have to find a new scale because I just learned there is an existing Riker scale for measuring a medical patient sedation. So maybe this isn't the best choice, but maybe I'll go with the Picard scale. We'll see. Anyways, if we look at the far left of the Riker scale, the lower end, the OK, we'll see an ArcGIS Enterprise Portal reader, and we've got hard-coded credentials in there to authenticate and connect to that portal. And so that's an OK on the Riker scale. If we move more towards the middle here, the nice area, we have a web service we've set up, an OAuth 2 web service that's going to connect to our ArcGIS portal. So that's a lot better, a little more secure. We've got our credentials wrapped up in there, and we're using tokens instead of hard-coded username and password. And then on the very nice, the far end of the Riker scale, we've got deployment parameters that we looked at in our demo. We're actually using two in that screenshot. We have one for our ArcGIS portal URL. So say in our environment, we have a test ArcGIS portal enterprise server, and we have a production ArcGIS enterprise portal server. And we also have a test FME Flow and prod FME Flow. So we want our workspace, depending on which FME Flow instance it's run on, to run against the appropriate ArcGIS portal. And so we're using deployment parameters for that, for both the connection to portal and also the portal URL. And I'll pass it back to Natalie to conclude things.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. So we hope we've highlighted this idea that a well-designed workspace or job in FME requires careful attention to parameter application and management. So it's not just about those transformers and those creative processes that are in action. The values supplied to those transformers and processes are just as crucial too. Again, we have this lovely warning reminding us of the importance of parameter values. So the better these values become, the better your outputs become. Or said in a different way, poor instructions will produce poor results. Use parameters creatively and effectively in your workflows. Don't be afraid to start playing with the various parameter types and parameter categories available in FME. as you start including more categories and types of parameters in your FME workflows, you'll likely begin to see a simplified user experience while reducing potential errors, as Evie demonstrated. An overall improvement to workflow maintainability on the long term will come with well-designed parameter use. This is particularly true with the application of those published in private user parameters, such as FME parameters, for example. And Matt demonstrated an improved workflow security with the application of some of those deployment parameters in place of hard-coded user credentials, as well as an improved workflow deployment with the use of those FME Flow parameters and deployment parameters combined. So overall, we hope we've encouraged you to avoid the defaults temptation. So it's really easy to leave parameter values as their defaults and just move on to the next part of building or running a workflow. And indeed, sticking with default values for Canvas objects will produce results, but not really the best results possible. So don't be afraid to deviate from those defaults and try being thoughtful and deliberate with your parameter values. They are there to let you achieve better outputs, so use them to your advantage whenever possible. And so I think I'm handing it off to Elizabeth now to take you through a little bit of a wrap up here.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks, Natalie. And I'll just take a moment quickly before we go into resources here to note that we'll be going into Q&A in a couple minutes time. So if you do have any questions at all on the material that was presented today, please do get those into the questions tab, and we'll take some time to look through those at the end. All right, so with that, our resources to help get you started. If you haven't yet gotten our ebook, Spatial Data for the Enterprise, that is a free resource, and the short link is there on the screen. As well as our FME Academy, it's a great place to learn all about FME, guided learning at your fingertips. The link is there as well. And similar to the knowledge base, which has a lot of how-tos and demos within that space. And lastly, but not least, the webinars page, safe.com/webinars. We have lots of great upcoming webinars, as well as probably hundreds of on-demand content. So if you're looking for a particular topic, you can certainly search for it there as well. And next steps. So if you'd like to chat with us about anything data whatsoever, please get in touch with us, info@safe.com. We'd love to have a conversation. And experience the FME Accelerator course. It's just 90 minutes free of charge, and it's a great place to get started with the basics of learning FME. As a thank you for joining us today, if you're a member of our community, we have a community badge code that you can redeem. I will drop that in the chat now. And if you aren't a part of the FME community yet, definitely check it out. It's a great place to both network with other users and also chat with experts and get any questions you might have answered there.
Awesome. And with that, I'll have our presenters join me on stage, and we can start on some Q&A. Some of you might be noticing that Elizabeth isn't here today to host the Q&A, but I'm Moyen, and I'll be filling in for Elizabeth as she's on her well-deserved vacation. And that being said, I do believe we have some questions that came in, so if we wanted to take a look at those. Yeah. How did it have to Evie or Natalie?
Yeah, so I see a question. Brad just asked for the code, and the code is in the chat. If you open the chat panel, it's the most recent message. So you can see that there. I'll just put it in the answer as well, just so you have that.
Perfect.
And then there was one other question about FME Flow parameter values. And they do get published on Flow. They say that they get plenty of errors when not removing the values before publishing. I feel like that's a good comment. I'm not sure that's a question, but yeah, I believe that is true. depending on what flow parameter it is that you're trying to publish to flow. Yeah.
If it is a kind of a prod stopping issue, filing a support ticket with us is always a good option. One of our flow experts would be happy to take a look and see if there's something we can suggest to improve that situation.
Yeah, and that goes for anything as well.
Yeah, there is one just to highlight. Oh, I just lost it. Sorry. Yeah, there it is. Ite was asking about automation parameters and use cases for automation parameters, and this is actually going to be part of our next webinar of the Essentials of Automations series. So that will be coming up in early October, I believe. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, I believe it's
like
the 8th.
Information on that topic. Yeah, October 8th. So tune in for that one, and you should get lots of information on that topic therein.
Yeah, so I see here, I'll start live answering this. Is it possible to create a workbench template containing predefined FME server parameters for reuse? So yes, you can save any workspace as a workbench template. So if you create a workspace and you want to use it later, you can always save it as a template. So yes, if you build out your FME Flow parameters, save it, and then reuse it later. Natalie, do you have anything to add on that?
That was going to be essentially my answer too. Is any the whole idea of a workspace template is exactly that, where you can pre-configure certain things for reuse. I myself have never pre-configured a template with flow parameters before, but I don't see why you couldn't. I don't see why you couldn't.
Yeah, exactly. I usually use templates for setting up transformers and like a certain workflow. And then you can also save your feature cache in a template too, so that's really handy.
Yeah, compatibility settings, that sort of thing. That's what I usually use mine for. Just looking through here. That's a really good question. The follow-up question from Drake, and I have to be honest, I'm not too sure about this one. It's owner and ran by on the flow side are always the same. Can you update the ran by value or collect that information at workspace runtime? I don't know if that's I'm not sure if that's something that's reported at runtime or if that's populated after the fact.
I'm not sure.
That's a question we could definitely follow up with offline, but I have to be honest, I'm not too sure about that one.
There is an FME flow parameter for runtime user and user ID. So perhaps you can utilize that.
And if running, yeah, there we go. If the user who's running, like if it's something of a service account that's running things, then it would always be.
Yeah,
it would always.
They
be
would
the
have
same.
to be. It would have to be a user that has an account and an ID. But the owner would stay the same no matter what, because that's who uploaded the workspace. And to change the owner, you would have to re-upload it by a different user, or change the I think you can also share the workspace as well to make that different as well. But
Yeah.
but
I'm not too sure that you can update that like just change that at runtime, so to speak. And I think, and yes, we will be sharing out the recording in a post-webinar follow-up email, just in case anyone's looking for that.
Yeah, and you'll be able to see the video, any of the workspaces we used, the slides, all of that will be able to be downloaded after. Yeah.
I think there's just one more question from John. It was in the regular chat, not in the Q&A section.
Oh, so about the Czech cell phone in Vancouver, do we get that out of the box included in FME Flow? And I don't believe this is a sample that is included in the installation of FME Flow, but the workspaces are included in the webinar, and you can download them separately. And then is it available? So see maybe in FME Cloud. So FME Cloud, now FME Flow hosted, is a deployment where we manage the deployment in AWS. Natalie went over that at the beginning of the webinar, but yeah, so that's just a separate deployment of FME Flow. And can you explain how that is licensed and accessed? Yeah, so it's just a separate deployment. It's accessed through the web, and it's just licensed separately. It's a separate product that we have a different price point and stuff. So if you have questions about that, we recommend that you contact sales, and they can go through all of those questions. Yeah.
Awesome. I think we've covered all of the questions. You can do one final scan, but okay. Perfect. I think we're at the top of the hour as well, and we've answered most of the questions that have come in. I just want to thank everyone for your attendance today. And if you do have a moment to fill out our webinar survey, we do appreciate any feedback as well. Big thank you to our presenter team for all your help with answering questions and also for helping with content creation. Yeah, have a good day, everyone. I will leave the webinar running just for another 5 minutes if anyone needs to save any links. But yeah, I think we're good to head out.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.